Millionaire got drunk and brought his mistress home. Pregnant wife humiliated them with a single word. Ladies and gentlemen, gather around and prepare yourselves for a story that will take you through the entire spectrum of human emotions. In this tumultuous tale of love, betrayal, and redemption, a charming millionaire husband comes home in the dead of night, drunk and with a young mistress on his arm, only to discover that his devoted wife is waiting. Little does he know, in mere moments, his world will be turned upside down by a single word uttered from her lips. Friends become enemies, secrets unravel, and destinies hang in the balance. Stay tuned, this is a drama you will never forget. Matthew Alcott was not born into wealth. On a brisk December morning in 1981, he entered the world in the small town of Glenhaven, somewhere in the American Midwest. His parents, Robert and Emily Alcott, ran a modest diner on the outskirts of town, serving up hearty breakfasts and friendly conversation to a loyal clientele. It was from these humble beginnings that Matthew learned both the value of hard work and the power of ambition. From a young age, Matthew had an uncanny ability to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. In middle school, he started a small business mowing lawns and raking leaves. By high school, he was repairing neighbors' computers for extra cash. His keen eye for business, bolstered by an indefatigable work ethic, propelled him to a top-tier university on scholarship. While his classmates spent weekends partying, Matthew found himself engrossed in marketing textbooks, enthralled by the potential of new business models in the digital age. It was during his sophomore year that he met Sarah Brown, a bright and empathetic psychology major who lived in the dorm room 2 floors below his. Initially, their interactions were limited to polite greetings in the hallway or awkwardly forced small talk at campus mixers. But one crisp autumn afternoon, they were both volunteering at a local community center, painting walls and cleaning the courtyard. The synergy of working side by side, combined with the shared satisfaction of helping others, sparked a deep admiration between them. Sarah was the exact opposite of Matthew in many ways. While he possessed an almost ruthless ambition, she believed in the importance of human connection and compassion above all else. At times, Matthew would get carried away with lofty dreams, discussing potential ventures that could net him millions. Sarah would ground him by reminding him of the importance of empathy, integrity, and kindness. This balance, the push and pull of 2 distinct personalities, built the foundation of a strong, healthy relationship. Over the years, the two formed an unbreakable bond that culminated in marriage shortly after graduation. They moved from campus life into a small starter apartment in Oak Ridge City, where Matthew secured an entry-level position at a tech startup. Sarah, meanwhile, worked at a non-profit organization that supported underprivileged families and mental health awareness programs. Their life was humble, their apartment cramped, yet their love felt infinite. Success came swiftly for Matthew. Before long, he wasn't just an employee at the tech company, he was climbing the ranks at a breakneck pace. His savvy in business negotiations and knack for sniffing out profitable niches earned him the respect of mentors, the admiration of peers, and eventually the attention of venture capitalists. By his early 30s, Matthew Alcott had orchestrated a series of shrewd investments and business deals that catapulted him to millionaire status. His circle of friends expanded, as did his professional responsibilities, which became more demanding by the day. Sarah, ever the supportive wife, remained at his side throughout this meteoric rise. She was proud of him. It wasn't the money or the social clout that impressed her, but the realization of the potential she'd seen in him from the very beginning. Though her modest upbringing in Bloomington had exposed her to the hardships many families face, she embraced Matthew's success with a gentle humility. However, with greater affluence and influence came an undeniable shift. Matthew's schedules turned hectic, dinners became business meetings, and weekends filled up with charity galas and exclusive networking events. Their once intimate relationship began to face new pressures. Sarah, striving to keep their connection alive, arranged romantic getaways and quality time at home, but more often than not, Matthew was glued to his phone or whisked away on a last-minute business trip. Through it all, Sarah's faith in Matthew never wavered. He was her husband, her best friend, and the father of their unborn child, though, at this point, that was still her secret. She wanted to tell him that she was expecting, but the timing never seemed right. And so, in the Alcott household, a silent tension began brewing beneath the veneer of success, threatening to explode at any moment. As the months passed, the Alcott home transformed from a warm haven into little more than a pit stop for Matthew. Their new mansion in the upscale neighborhood of Silver Oak Heights was lavishly decorated with marble countertops, gleaming hardwood floors, and panoramic windows overlooking a beautifully manicured lawn. Yet for all its grandeur, the house often felt empty and cold. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on when the distance truly began. Perhaps it started when Matthew first declined one of her carefully planned date nights, citing an important investors' conference call. Or maybe it was the time he flew to Tokyo for 2 weeks without giving her more than a day's notice. Each time, she would smile, nod, and say she understood. But inside, each small disappointment chipped away at her sense of togetherness. She was patient to a fault, always offering compassion where frustration would have been reasonable. From time to time, concerned friends and family asked Sarah if everything was all right. Her mother, Patricia Brown, especially worried about her daughter's emotional health. "He works so much these days," Patricia would say gently. "Have the two of you talked about spending more quality time together?" Sarah would shrug it off with a soft, reassuring smile, saying they were fine. She held tight to the belief that once his workload stabilized, they would regain their old rhythm. Then there was the matter of Sarah's own career. She had left the non-profit organization to focus on the philanthropic branch of Matthew's company. She immersed herself in charitable programs, building scholarship funds and community outreach initiatives. Although fulfilling, this new path was often overshadowed by her husband's growing celebrity in the business world. During galas, reporters flocked to him for interviews, leaving Sarah standing on the fringes. In those moments, she felt like a supporting character in a play that bore her husband's name in bright lights. Despite everything, Sarah still believed that she could rekindle the closeness they once shared. She tried talking to him during the few spare minutes they had together each morning, but he was in a perpetual rush. She tried scheduling couples therapy, but he cancelled the appointment twice. She tried surprising him at the office with a homemade lunch, only to be told by his assistant, Cheryl Moore, that he was in a high-level meeting and could not be disturbed. It was also around this time that Sarah began noticing subtle changes in Matthew's behavior. He spent a lot of time exchanging text messages or whispering into his phone. He seemed more guarded about his personal devices, swiftly turning screens away when she walked by. Although she had never been the suspicious type, she couldn't ignore the intuitive nudge suggesting something was amiss. One evening, a hint of the truth emerged at a charity auction at the Brighton Hotel. Sarah was mingling with attendees, promoting the company's new educational initiative. As she approached a group that included Matthew, a sleek brunette, in a shimmering black gown, seemed particularly close to him, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm, whispering in his ear. Her name, Sarah later learned, was Cynthia Henderson, a rising star in the real estate world. Sarah tried to brush off the sinking feeling in her stomach. She told herself that Cynthia was just another socialite or business contact. Yet something about the woman's demeanor, her effortless confidence, and the way Matthew's eyes lit up when speaking to her made Sarah uneasy. Even so, she had always trusted Matthew implicitly. The idea of him crossing any boundary felt almost unthinkable. She kept her suspicions to herself, hoping that she was merely imagining things. Unknown to Sarah, she was not alone in her worry. David Robertson, Matthew's oldest friend from Glenhaven, had also noticed the subtle shift in Matthew's priorities. Over bourbon one evening, David gently asked Matthew if everything was all right at home. Matthew brushed the question off, claiming that Sarah was simply stressed by new responsibilities and that he needed space to focus on business expansions. David eyed him cautiously, unsure how to proceed, but said nothing more. Just a few days after this conversation, Sarah discovered a receipt for an expensive necklace in Matthew's jacket pocket. She hadn't received any jewelry from him in months. At first, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe it was a surprise gift for her. But the doubt crept in swiftly, dark and insidious, sowing the first real seeds of mistrust in her heart. Yet even with mounting evidence, Sarah refused to confront Matthew outright. She told herself she needed more clarity, more certainty before making accusations. Besides, she was pregnant, though she still hadn't found the right moment to break the news. She reasoned that adding another layer of stress might worsen an already precarious situation. Little did she know how drastically her life was about to change when that final grain of suspicion tipped the scale. Matthew was no villain, at least not at his core. But he had begun to feel an insidious longing for something outside of his marriage, something thrilling, dangerous, and new. Despite the love he once felt for Sarah, the routine of their daily life had started to chafe him. He was used to adrenaline-pumping deals, high-stakes negotiations, and the ego-boosting admiration of business associates. Coming home to quiet dinners and subdued conversations about community projects felt anticlimactic. When Cynthia Henderson entered his life, the temptation was immediate, though he didn't recognize it as such at first. She was introduced to him at a networking event by Oliver Carmichael, an investment partner who was expanding into real estate. Cynthia exuded a kind of magnetic confidence. She was fiercely intelligent and knew how to command attention in a room. They talked mostly about real estate prospects and philanthropic ventures, discovering a shared interest in modern architecture and new development projects. What began as professional camaraderie soon escalated into late-night dinners under the guise of discussing business. Cynthia would sip her wine, leaning in ever so slightly, her perfume lingering in the air. Matthew found himself listening more intently to her opinions than he had to anyone else's in a long time. She was everything Sarah wasn't in the moment, bold, exciting, and unencumbered by domestic life. At first, he convinced himself that their relationship was purely platonic. After all, networking with influential people was part of his job. But with each text message and each secretive phone call, his moral compass skewed further from true north. He found reasons to meet Cynthia in private settings, sometimes at her loft in the city, other times at exclusive lounges where they knew they wouldn't run into mutual acquaintances. The shift from emotional closeness to physical intimacy was quick. Fueled by Cynthia's allure and his own unchecked ego, Matthew crossed a line one evening at a business conference in San Francisco. A dinner meeting evolved into a lengthy conversation in Cynthia's suite, which culminated in a moment of lust that was impossible to take back. Yet, in the haze of the following morning, he felt less guilt than he expected. Instead, he felt an odd mixture of euphoria and power, certain he could maintain both his home life and this new excitement on the side. Cynthia was not naive. She knew Matthew was married, and she seemed to relish the intrigue. She often hinted at how privileged she felt to have one of the city's most influential men under her sway. Whenever Matthew hesitated or showed signs of returning to Sarah, Cynthia would dangle the thrill of their affair like forbidden fruit. She was careful to flatter him at every turn, praising his business acumen, his ambition, and even the way he dressed. The more time Matthew spent with Cynthia, the more distant he became from Sarah. Now, even Sarah's gentle smiles and unwavering support seemed like obligations. The very qualities that once endeared her to him, her stability, her compassion, now felt dull compared to Cynthia's allure of mystery and danger. Self-justifications piled up in Matthew's mind. He was not abusing Sarah, financially or otherwise. He was simply taking advantage of his new social and economic status. Men in power do this all the time, he told himself. It doesn't mean I don't love my wife. But in his quieter moments, the flicker of guilt turned into a firestorm of anxiety. He would recall Sarah's shining eyes on their wedding day, the unwavering trust she placed in him. Sometimes he'd see the old photo on the mantel, Sarah and him in their graduation gowns, beaming proudly. A pang of regret would course through him, but then the next message from Cynthia would arrive, inviting him to some exclusive property, unveiling, or a private dinner. And so the vicious cycle continued. In the midst of this, Sarah had no conclusive proof, but her suspicions were morphing into certainty. The carefully concealed receipts, the hushed phone calls, the intangible space in their bed at night, it all pointed to one conclusion. Yet she refrained from confrontation, more out of heartbreak than fear. She still carried within her a secret that could change everything. She was pregnant, and every moment she waited felt like an eternity. Little did Matthew know that his carefully balanced world would soon collapse. Success, secrecy, and seduction were an explosive combination, needing just the right spark to go up in flames. And that spark would come far sooner than he expected, igniting a night that would alter the course of all their lives forever. Cynthia Henderson was a name whispered in elite circles as a rising star in real estate, but her background was far more complicated than she let on. She hailed from a struggling family in Maple Grove, where finances were tight and ambition was the only way out. Cynthia had set her sights high from an early age. She worked 3 jobs through college, earning a degree in economics and building her network with relentless determination. When she met Matthew Alcott, she recognized something in him that mirrored her own drive, a hunger for success that was never fully satisfied. That shared intensity drew them together like magnets, but Cynthia's motivations went beyond mere passion or admiration. She saw in Matthew a gateway to the upper echelons of wealth and influence, a realm she'd only peered into from the outside. Their affair was more than a fling to her. It was an opportunity to secure her place among the city's elite. In her private moments, Cynthia might have felt a twinge of guilt. She knew Matthew was married, but those pangs were overshadowed by her desire for a life of luxury. She enjoyed the lavish gifts, the hushed dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and the bragging rights of being involved with one of Oakbridge City's business giants. Even if she didn't openly admit it, she saw Sarah as an obstacle, a relic from Matthew's simpler past that needed to be pushed aside. Away from Matthew, Cynthia confided in her closest friend, Lauren Bell, who knew every detail of the scandalous affair. Over cocktails in plush lounges, she'd describe how Matthew was putty in her hands, how he was so enraptured by her that he'd neglect to return home until late. Lauren cautioned her about overstepping boundaries. You don't want to destroy his marriage. That could backfire on you. Cynthia shrugged off the warning, feeling untouchable. She believed that once Matthew was fully in her grasp, he would prioritize her over everything else, including Sarah. Unbeknownst to either Matthew or Cynthia, the intricacies of their relationship were starting to come under scrutiny. Rumors circulated in the city's tight-knit business community. Whispers reached the ears of David Robertson, who was already uneasy about Matthew's behavior. David quietly confronted Cynthia at a real estate networking event, politely warning her not to manipulate his friend. Cynthia's response was icy. "He's a grown man, David. He makes his own decisions." David sensed the danger in Cynthia's words. He tried to talk to Matthew, urging him to come clean about whatever was happening, but Matthew dismissed him with a defensive anger that told David his suspicions were correct. Furious and worried, David decided the best course of action was to keep an eye on the situation and, if need be, involve Sarah before matters escalated beyond repair. Meanwhile, at the Alcott mansion, Sarah was living in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had nearly broken down earlier that week when she tried to share her pregnancy news, only for Matthew to cut the conversation short with a rushed excuse about an urgent business call. The heartbreak was palpable. She spent more and more time alone in the spacious residence, her world suddenly feeling too large and too empty. Sarah's biggest fear was becoming an afterthought to her own husband. The sense of betrayal clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake off. Still, her patience and love for Matthew hadn't completely eroded. She reminded herself of the man he used to be, the boy from Glenhaven, who worked tirelessly at his parents' diner, the university student who once chased her around the library just to share a silly joke. She held on to these memories, hoping they weren't relics of a time forever lost. Every so often, Sarah sought solace by visiting Patricia Brown, her mother, who lived a short drive away in a cozy suburban house in Willow Creek. Over tea in the warm, sunlit living room, Sarah would carefully skirt around the full truth, but confide enough for her mother to sense that all was not well. Patricia would hold Sarah's hands and say, "You must have faith in yourself. You're stronger than you think." The comfort of her mother's words was a soothing balm, but it did little to quell the storm of anxiety raging within her. That storm raged even louder in Cynthia's mind, though fueled by a different ambition. She fantasized about replacing Sarah, taking her place not just by Matthew's side, but in the Alcott mansion too. She envisaged herself hosting opulent gatherings, flaunting her new role as the hostess of one of the most prominent homes in the city. But for all her plotting, Cynthia had yet to experience the full measure of Sarah's resolve. Sarah might have appeared gentle, even meek, but beneath her calm exterior lay a strength forged by loyalty, love, and a deep sense of self-worth. It was only a matter of time before the two women's paths converged in a confrontation that could not be avoided. And when that happened, even Cynthia's carefully orchestrated plans could be undone with a single word. Sarah's secret pregnancy began to weigh heavily on her conscience. She was already several weeks along, far enough that she had started feeling subtle changes in her body. Every morning brought a fresh wave of nausea, which she blamed on stress whenever Matthew was around. Her doctor, Dr. Melissa Carter, urged her to take it easy and maintain a healthy environment for the baby, cautioning that excessive emotional turmoil could be harmful. But how could Sarah relax when her life felt like it was teetering on the edge of a cliff? Each of Matthew's late-night arrivals roused her from restless sleep, only for him to offer half-baked excuses. He claimed an endless stream of urgent business negotiations or emergency client dinners. She wanted to believe him truly. She did, but her heart told her otherwise. One fateful afternoon, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the caller ID, David Robertson. Curiosity piqued. She picked up. David's tone was cautious yet firm. He confessed that something felt off about Matthew's recent conduct and that he suspected foul play. Though he avoided explicit details, his words confirmed her worst fears. He suggested that Sarah confront Matthew directly or consider hiring a private investigator. Sarah was too distraught to decide on the spot, but she appreciated David's concern. She realized he was one of the few people genuinely looking out for her well-being. After a sleepless night, Sarah decided that she could no longer ignore the signs. Although she wasn't ready to launch a direct confrontation, she resolved to unravel the truth. She began keeping a small notebook in which she jotted down oddities, suspicious text messages she glimpsed on Matthew's phone, unexplained credit card charges, and the nights he claimed to be working late. It was meticulous, heartbreaking work, like building a case against the man she loved, piece by painful piece. The more she uncovered, the clearer Cynthia's presence in Matthew's life became. She discovered a recurring charge for a private lounge called the Amber Room, a venue well known for its exclusive clientele and discreet atmosphere. Cross-referencing the dates of these charges with Matthew's absences, she saw a chilling alignment. She also found a receipt for flowers that had never appeared on their dining room table, and a cryptic text message on Matthew's phone, which she only glimpsed briefly, stating, "Can't wait to see you again." The sender's name was saved simply as CH. Each new clue felt like a physical blow. She experienced waves of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak so potent she sometimes had to steady herself against the wall just to catch her breath. Yet, amid it all, she felt a strange sense of focus. If Matthew had truly betrayed her, she needed to know for certain so she could decide how to proceed. Meanwhile, Matthew felt the tension thickening between them. Sarah's demeanor had shifted from gentle concern to guarded detachment. She wasn't asking as many questions, yet he sensed an undercurrent of suspicion whenever their eyes met. Guilt gnawed at him, but the pull of Cynthia's allure still overshadowed any inclination to come clean. One evening, Sarah mustered the courage to test Matthew directly. Over dinner, she casually mentioned she might accompany him on his next business trip. His reaction was immediate. A strained smile, a stammered excuse that it was all very technical and uninteresting, followed by an uneasy shift in his seat. She felt her heart sink. It was all but a confession. That night, as Matthew stood in the living room, quietly sipping whiskey and staring into the darkness beyond their lavish patio, he wondered how long he could maintain this facade. He knew a confrontation with Sarah was inevitable. Despite his bravado, he feared her capacity for grace, kindness, and even more so righteous anger. He also questioned if he had any shred of moral fiber left in him, or if the thirst for excitement had entirely consumed his better judgment. Sarah, for her part, retreated to the master bedroom and pressed a hand to her abdomen. Her baby. A new life. She longed to share the news with Matthew in a moment of unbridled joy. Instead, the father of her child seemed increasingly like a stranger to her. She wondered if the strong, principled man she fell in love with still existed behind the mask of ambition and temptation. The Alcott household, once filled with laughter, felt like a mansion of mirrors, every reflection warped, every corner hiding secrets. Each day brought them closer to the inevitable collapse, where the illusions would fall away and only raw truth would remain. And in that upcoming storm, Cynthia Henderson stood poised like a hawk in the distance, awaiting her chance to claim the spoils of the conflict she had helped create. The night began like many others. Matthew claimed he had a business dinner at an exclusive restaurant downtown, while Sarah feigned acceptance and retreated to her own routine. She knew better than to believe his story. An hour before his supposed meeting time, she drove past the Amber Room. Sure enough, tucked away in the VIP parking lot was Matthew's sleek, black Maserati. Her heart clenched, but she kept driving, too paralyzed by fear and heartbreak to confront him in public. Hours later, well after midnight, Matthew stumbled through the front door of their mansion, except this time, he wasn't alone. Cynthia Henderson, wearing a tight red dress with stiletto heels, hung onto his arm. The smell of alcohol emanated from both of them, mingling with the faint perfume drifting off Cynthia's skin. Sarah, who had been sitting in the living room, shot upright from the couch. She stared at them, disbelieving. Despite all her suspicions, she had never imagined he would bring his mistress to their home. The raw disrespect made her stomach churn. Matthew's glassy eyes tried to focus on Sarah's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but the liquor stole his ability to form coherent sentences. Cynthia, on the other hand, seemed more than willing to speak. With a half smile, she drawled, "Oh, I didn't think you'd still be awake." Sarah felt a flash of hot rage surge through her chest. She had rehearsed countless scenarios of confrontation in her mind, but none as brazen as this. Her voice trembled with barely contained anger. "Clearly, you're not the only one who miscalculated." Matthew attempted to steer Cynthia toward the staircase, perhaps intending to remove her from Sarah's sight, but Sarah blocked their path. Her eyes flicked between them, searching for the husband she once knew, but in that moment, he was nowhere to be found, only a shambling figure caught in a web of betrayal. "Matthew," she said, voice low, "what are you doing? How dare you bring her here?" Before he could answer, Cynthia let out a drunken giggle, swaying on her heels. "He's just showing me where he lives," she said, leaning heavily against the banister. "We were celebrating a business deal." Sarah's blood boiled at the audacity. She locked eyes with Matthew. "A business deal?" she asked coldly. His face contorted in shame, but he still didn't speak. In a single, horrifying instant, Sarah realized the depth of contempt in this act. Whether it was fueled by alcohol, arrogance, or some twisted desire to flaunt his affair, Matthew had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Ignoring Cynthia, Sarah looked at her husband with a mixture of heartbreak and determination. "Get her out of my house," she commanded, her voice trembling. "Right now." Matthew stammered something incoherent, then tried to guide Cynthia back to the door. But Cynthia resisted, drunk bravado fueling her. She turned to Sarah with a mocking smile. "If you really cared about him, you'd realize you two are done. He deserves someone who can keep up with him, not a wife stuck in domestic boredom." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She felt a deep, protective instinct rising not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. Still, she held back, refusing to stoop to Cynthia's level of petty insults. She simply repeated, "Get her out, Matthew." Eventually, Matthew managed to coax Cynthia back outside, though she shot a venomous parting glance at Sarah. The front door slammed behind them, leaving Sarah in stunned silence. She stood there, heart pounding, wondering if she had just experienced the end of her marriage in one traumatic burst. Minutes later, Matthew returned alone. He looked dazed, unsure what to do or say. Sarah, arms folded, stared him down, unwavering. The tension was palpable, a thick fog of anger and betrayal enveloping them both. Matthew tried to speak, but Sarah cut him off. "Don't say anything right now. I can't even look at you." With that, she walked away, leaving Matthew in the foyer to sober up to the harsh reality of his actions. He listened to her footsteps, ascending the grand staircase until the bedroom door slammed. It occurred to him in that moment that he had just undone years of trust in a single, reckless night. As the house fell silent, Matthew slumped against the wall, head in his hands. He wondered if there was any path left to redemption, or if he'd just lost the one person who had always believed in him. Outside, the city lights flickered in the darkness, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding within the Alcott mansion. And inside, a wife's heart hardened by betrayal began to summon a strength she never knew she possessed. The morning after, the Alcott mansion felt eerily quiet. Sarah awoke to an empty space beside her in bed, though she had no desire to see if Matthew had slept in one of the guest rooms. Her head pounded with a mixture of rage and sorrow, but beneath it all lay a strange clarity. The moment had come for a final reckoning. She stood at the bathroom mirror, eyes swollen from crying, yet her spine was straight with resolve. She gently rested a hand on her abdomen, reminding herself that she wasn't alone. Her unborn child was depending on her. If she needed more motivation to confront Matthew, that realization provided it in abundance. Downstairs, she found him seated at the dining table, nursing a cup of black coffee. He looked disheveled, eyes bloodshot, as though he'd slept no more than an hour. As Sarah entered, he stood up abruptly, fumbling for words. "Sarah, She raised a hand to silence him. "I don't want to hear meaningless apologies. I want the truth." His eyes darted around, searching for a way to lessen the blow. Cynthia was just a mistake," he mumbled. "I was drunk." "And stop," Sarah interjected, her voice calm but commanding. "Don't insult my intelligence. I know this has been going on for a while. I'm not interested in half-truths." Matthew's shoulders sagged under the weight of his guilt. "I'm sorry," he finally managed. "I never meant for this to go so far." Sarah took a deep breath, pain etched into every feature of her face. "You brought her here," she said, voice quivering. "Into our home, Matthew. Do you realize how disrespectful that is? After everything we've shared, you humiliated me in my own house." He couldn't meet her gaze. "I was drunk," she insisted. His words trailed off when he noticed that Sarah was shaking. Not out of weakness, but out of sheer fury. Still, she managed to keep her composure. "Tell me, do you love her?" Matthew hesitated, and the silence was excruciating. Finally, he shook his head, eyes downcast. "No, it was never about love." Sarah released a long, trembling breath. Her hands gripped the back of a dining chair. This was her moment to speak her piece, to choose what path lay ahead. "Everything we built together, our marriage, our home, our future, how could you throw that away?" He wiped a hand across his face, his expression anguished. "I don't want to lose you." She stared at him, heart racing. "Then why didn't you stop? All those nights, you lied to me. You lied to yourself." "I can't explain it," he croaked. "I was stupid, selfish. I was chasing excitement, I guess. You have to believe me, I never wanted to hurt you." A bitter laugh escaped Sarah's lips. "But you did, Matthew. You tore us apart." Then she swallowed hard, bracing for the words she never imagined she'd speak. "I'm pregnant." His head snapped up. Shock and confusion registered in his eyes. You're pregnant?" he echoed, voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me?" She shook her head, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. "When? You were never around. And even when you were so distant. I was afraid it would only add more tension. But now, after everything..." Her voice faltered, and for a moment she considered simply walking out, leaving him with his regrets. Matthew seemed paralyzed, as if the enormity of what he'd done was sinking in for the first time. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." For a moment, the room was thick with emotion. The future of their marriage, of their family, hovered on a precipice. Then, with startling resolve, Sarah spoke a single word that cut through the chaos like a knife. "Leave." She paused, letting the word echo in the stillness. "You can come back when you've decided who you want to be, and if there's any room left in my heart to forgive you. But for now, go. I don't want to look at you." Matthew stood there, stunned, as if he couldn't process the command. "Sarah," she pointed to the door. "Go," she repeated, her voice as cold and final as a judge's gavel. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. The mansion fell silent once more, the weight of Sarah's single word still reverberating in the air. She slumped into a chair, sobbing quietly, clutching her abdomen. She had never felt so vulnerable, nor so powerful. For years she had fought to hold her marriage together, enduring heartbreak after heartbreak in the hope that Matthew would return to the man she once knew. But now, she realized, real love demanded respect, and sometimes the strongest act of love was standing up for oneself, even if it meant letting go. News of the Alcott marriage crisis spread quickly through the city's high society circles. By the end of the week, rumors swirled at country clubs, cocktail lounges, and boardrooms. Some whispered that Matthew had been locked out of the mansion indefinitely. Others claimed Sarah had served him divorce papers. Still others speculated that Cynthia Henderson was practically living in his penthouse suite at the Aurora Hotel. In truth, none of these rumors were entirely accurate yet. Matthew found himself temporarily crashing in one of his own corporate apartments, a sterile space on the 26th floor of a gleaming downtown skyscraper. Although it offered a panoramic view of the city, the silence within was stifling. He spent his nights nursing regrets and rehashing his mistakes, replaying the image of Sarah's tear-streaked face, commanding him to leave. Cynthia Henderson attempted to reach out multiple times, calling and texting him incessantly, but Matthew's responses grew terse and infrequent. The allure that had once drawn him to her had faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of shame. He ignored her invitations to exclusive events and let her calls go to voicemail. Eventually, her frustration boiled over. One afternoon, she showed up unannounced at his corporate apartment, pounding on the door until he let her in. "What's going on, Matthew?" Cynthia demanded, pacing the living room like a caged tigress. "Are you just going to shut me out now that your wife caught on?" His shoulders slumped. "Things have changed, Cynthia." "I need time to think," she scoffed. "Think about what? You already made your choice when you left her house." He raked a hand through his hair. "No, she told me to leave. There's a difference." With a derisive laugh, Cynthia sank onto the sofa. "So what, you're going to beg her forgiveness now? She's already kicked you out, you might as well move on." Matthew looked away, wrestling with conflicting emotions. He recalled Sarah's trembling voice as she revealed her pregnancy, the shock and regret he felt at that moment. "You don't understand," he said softly. "I love her, I always did, and she's carrying my child." Cynthia's eyes narrowed, and a flicker of genuine hurt crossed her face. She had known on some level that Matthew was never truly hers, but hearing him confess it aloud stung. She stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. "Fine," she snapped. "If you decide you actually want me, you know where to find me, but I won't wait forever." Once the door slammed behind her, Matthew felt both relief and sorrow. He had lost almost everything in a few short weeks: his wife's trust, his unborn child's secure future, and even the misguided thrill he'd pursued. Alone in the sterile apartment, he wondered if redemption was possible or if he was destined to live with his regrets. Meanwhile, Sarah navigated her own emotional turmoil. She had confided the full extent of her situation to Patricia Brown, who immediately offered unconditional support. "Come stay with me if you need," Patricia pleaded. But Sarah decided to remain in the mansion, determined to claim the space for herself and the baby she carried. She spent her days re-centering her life, picking out potential nursery designs, scheduling appointments with Dr. Carter, and even resuming some philanthropic work through her contacts. Her nights, however, were haunted by memories of Matthew. She would wander through the quiet halls, recalling times they'd danced in the living room or cooked dinner together in the sparkling kitchen. Occasionally, she'd break down, collapsing onto a sofa or leaning against a wall as sobs racked her body. Yet, each morning, she found the resolve to keep going. David Robertson visited frequently, offering her both emotional support and practical help with Matthew's business dealings. "You should take a more active role in his company," David suggested. "You have the authority as his spouse and shareholder, and it might protect you financially if things go south." Sarah hesitated, not wanting to entangle herself further in Matthew's empire. But the safety net was tempting. If she was going to raise a child, possibly alone, she needed stability. Every so often Matthew tried calling, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to desperate. Sarah listened to each one in full, tears burning her eyes, but she never called back. She understood that both of them needed time and space. Her single word, leave, had ripped the band-aid off a festering wound. Perhaps letting that wound air was the only way it could ever begin to heal. The city around them continued to buzz with gossip, oblivious to the depths of personal anguish each was experiencing. Cynthia, for her part, tried to maintain her professional momentum, although she couldn't escape questions about her involvement with Matthew. She avoided eye contact at networking events, mumbled half-hearted denials, and eventually withdrew from the social scene to escape the scandalous spotlight. Behind the scenes, the Alcott empire was weathering its own storm. Investors grew wary of the scandal's potential repercussions. Some withdrew from projects, while others reassured Matthew's executives that this was merely a personal matter. Yet the intangible damage, loss of trust, strained relationships with key business partners loomed over every board meeting. For the first time in his life, Matthew found himself on the brink of both personal and professional collapse. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, a quiet resilience stirred within Sarah. She found a new kind of strength in adversity, an understanding that her worth was not solely tied to being a faithful, supportive wife. Yes, she was that, but she was also a woman who deserved respect. And soon enough, the moment would arrive when she and Matthew would have to face each other again, this time with the weight of their unborn child's future pressing down on every word, every decision, every breath. Weeks turned into a month. The scandal surrounding Matthew's marital collapse slowly receded from tabloid headlines, replaced by new stories and fresher gossip. But for those directly involved, the repercussions were far from over. Matthew poured his energy into stabilizing his company, working late into the night from his corporate apartment. He closed 2 major deals that had been in the pipeline, partly to demonstrate to investors that his personal issues wouldn't derail the business. Yet, whenever he had a moment of quiet, his thoughts inevitably drifted to Sarah and the child he had yet to truly acknowledge. He wrestled with guilt and a desire for redemption. Over many sleepless nights, he realized that Sarah wasn't merely an extension of his life, she was the core of it, the moral compass he had abandoned. The lust for excitement that once enthralled him now felt hollow, overshadowed by the loneliness of a cold apartment and the absence of her warm presence. One rainy afternoon, David Robertson stopped by. He wasted no time with pleasantries. "Matthew, you have to clean up your act and talk to her. She's doing better without you, if I'm being honest, but you owe her at least an honest conversation." Matthew clasped his hands together, studying the pattern of raindrops on the window. "I know," he sighed. "I just don't know what to say. Start with the truth. Apologize. And if you really want to be a father to that child, you need to prove it to Sarah." Matthew nodded, tears threatening to surface. "I hate what I did to her," he whispered. "I hate myself for it." That same day, unbeknownst to Matthew, Cynthia quietly announced her departure from the real estate firm she'd been employed at. Rumor had it, she was taking a sabbatical to focus on personal projects. In truth, she was fleeing from the fallout of her public indiscretions, which had cost her the trust of key clients. She never contacted Matthew again, though a single text buzzed on his phone late one night. "We had fun, but everything ends. Good luck." He deleted it without replying. Meanwhile, Sarah found solace in her growing baby bump, which was now visible enough that she couldn't hide it even if she wanted to. With Patricia's support, she had transformed one of the mansion's spare rooms into a nursery-light yellow walls, soft pastel accents, and a rocking chair by the window. Though she dreaded the possibility of raising the child on her own, she also felt an undercurrent of excitement about the future. One evening, while sorting through baby clothes, she paused at the sight of a tiny pair of socks, realizing that the baby would one day take its first steps on these marble floors. Her eyes welled with tears, torn between heartbreak and hope. She wondered whether Matthew would be present for those milestone moments or whether she'd face them alone. As if in answer, her phone rang. The caller ID displayed Matthew's name. Her pulse quickened. She debated letting it go to voicemail, but a wave of empathy washed over her. She answered with a hesitant, "Hello." His voice was strained, but earnest. "Sarah, can we talk?" She was silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she said, "All right, tomorrow afternoon, here." When Matthew arrived at the mansion the next day, he was a different man, pale, anxious, and remorseful. He wore a simple suit, a far cry from his usual power-tailored attire. Sarah led him into the living room, where they sat opposite each other on couches that felt miles apart. He cleared his throat. "Sarah, I can't take back what I did, but I want to try to make amends, if you'll let me. I want to be here for you and our child." She took a moment to collect her thoughts, her gaze unwavering. "Why should I believe you?" He clasped his hands, looking down. "Because I can't live with myself if I don't try. I've cut off all contact with Cynthia. It's over. I've been talking to a therapist, trying to figure out why I..." His voice broke, and he looked up, eyes brimming with tears. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I need you to know I'm committed to changing." Sarah felt her eyes mist over, but she held firm. "Commitment isn't just words, Matthew. It's actions, day after day. I told you to leave because I needed space. I still need to see that you've changed." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand." A long silence settled between them, thick with unspoken pain and the faintest glimmer of hope. Sarah finally stood, and Matthew followed suit, uncertain of what came next. She folded her arms protectively over her belly. "I'm willing to see if you can keep your word," she said cautiously. "For the baby's sake, if nothing else." Matthew exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Thank you. I promise I'll do whatever it takes." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "This isn't a second chance, Matthew. It's a test. Don't fail it." With that, she showed him to the door, each step echoing in the hall, as if underscoring the fragile nature of their future. Outside, rain clouds gathered, casting a gloom over the manicured lawn. Inside, Sarah closed the door, leaning against it. Part of her wanted to collapse into sobs, but another part of her felt an unfamiliar stir of strength. She had laid down her boundaries, stood up for her self-worth, and now it was up to Matthew to meet her where she stood. Whether their love story would end in redemption or ruin remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: Sarah was no longer the passive figure in the background. She was the architect of her life, and that of the child she carried, come what may. Over the next several weeks, Matthew worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust he had so carelessly shattered. He moved out of the corporate apartment, but did not immediately return to the mansion. Instead, he rented a modest townhouse close to Sarah's neighborhood, allowing him to be near if she needed anything. Gone were the late-night outings and secret rendezvous. His days now revolved around therapy sessions. Business responsibilities he handled with renewed integrity, and carefully timed visits to see Sarah. True to her word, Sarah allowed him back in small increments. Sometimes he would come by to help assemble a crib or discuss parenting plans. Their interactions were measured, cordial, but wary. Sarah had no interest in half-forgiven confessions or empty apologies. She observed Matthew closely, noting how he spoke, how he carried himself, and whether his actions matched his words. In therapy, Matthew confronted the roots of his destructive behavior. He acknowledged the adrenaline rush of success had made him crave validation, Affairs, power plays, and endless business deals had been a toxic cocktail fueling his ego. Admitting these weaknesses stung, but he found surprising clarity in the confession. He realized that the man he once was principled, hard-working, and loving had been overtaken by a never-ending pursuit of more. Slowly, he began mending relationships in his business circle too. He made personal phone calls to disillusioned investors, assuring them of a more transparent leadership style. He reconnected with employees he'd neglected, listening to their concerns and building a healthier corporate culture. While not everyone accepted his transformation at face value, they saw enough genuine effort to grant him cautious optimism. One bright afternoon, Sarah allowed him to drive her to a doctor's appointment. The two sat in the waiting room, an unspoken tension hovering between them. But when Dr. Carter invited them in for an ultrasound, everything shifted. The rhythmic sound of their baby's heartbeat seemed to wash away the negativity that had drowned their relationship. Watching the tiny figure on the monitor, Matthew felt tears slide down his cheeks. Sarah, sensing the gravity of the moment, reached out and took his hand. "It's strong," said Dr. Carter with a reassuring smile. "Everything looks healthy so far." In that intimate moment, the weight of their shared history pressed in on them. For a brief instant, Sarah saw a glimpse of the man she'd married, the young, earnest Matthew from Glenhaven. She pressed his hand gently before releasing it, uncertain but hopeful. After the appointment, they walked out to the parking lot in silence. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Thank you for coming with me." Matthew nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "I'm grateful you let me. I know I don't deserve it." Sarah paused by the car, exhaling slowly. "I don't want to hate you, Matthew, and I don't think I do, but trust. That takes time to rebuild." "I understand," he said softly. "I'll earn it back, one day at a time." In the following weeks, their relationship found a fragile equilibrium. They weren't the carefree lovers they'd once been, nor were they cold strangers. They were two people bound by a shared past and an unborn child's future, cautiously traversing the path of reconciliation. Matthew came by on weekends to help with household chores and nursery prep. They ate a few dinners together, discussing baby names and birth plans, with a mixture of awkwardness and anticipation. Occasional setbacks tested their resolve. A stray message from Cynthia, a tense business dinner, or a memory of betrayal could plunge them into turmoil. But each time, Matthew faced the discomfort head-on, refusing to run or hide. Sarah, in turn, allowed herself to see his sincerity, though she guarded her heart fiercely. When the baby finally arrived, a beautiful, healthy girl, they both wept tears of joy and relief. In the hospital room, as Sarah cradled the tiny infant, Matthew stood by her side, his gaze filled with awe. Overcome with emotion, he whispered, "I'm sorry for everything. I promise to spend the rest of my life making it right." In that moment, Sarah looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. She saw remorse, commitment, and the kind of love that might endure after all. Whether forgiveness would fully blossom was still uncertain, but hope took root in her heart. She pressed her cheek to their daughter's small head, feeling the warmth of new life, bridging the chasms of betrayal. Days later, they brought the baby home to the Alcott mansion. It was a home that had once stood as a monument to success, but was now infused with a deeper meaning, a place of growth, redemption, and fragile unity. As they stepped through the door, Sarah remembered the night Matthew had brought Cynthia there, the shameful moment that had nearly destroyed them, and she recalled the single word she had wielded to protect her dignity: leave. Now, as she watched Matthew carry their daughter inside with tender care, she realized that sometimes letting someone go is the only way to truly bring them back. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, she felt a genuine surge of optimism. Their story was far from perfect, but perhaps in its imperfection lay the seeds of a stronger, more authentic love. And so, dear viewers, our story comes to an end, or rather, to a new beginning. The Alcott Mansion, once a battleground of betrayal, has become a place where a wounded husband fights to redeem himself and a wife discovers the unbreakable power of her own self-worth. The true drama lies not in the fall from grace, but in the uncertain climb toward reconciliation. If this emotional roller coaster of heartbreak, hope, and hard-won forgiveness moved you, please show your support. Click like, share this story with friends who might need a reminder that even in the darkest of times there's a spark of light. And subscribe to this channel for more tales that dive deep into the human soul. Your engagement helps keep stories of resilience alive, and who knows, the next dramatic twist might be just a click away.